as he got older, it was harder to write, as he said, new ideas. But he said he was very proud of two essays that he wrote, and this one was one of them. So
Oh,
it
no
took,
kidding.
he himself thought that he was proud of this work. And I think the other thing why, if I would have voted for it, I would have given this reason, which is, in a way, it's a culminating piece. Gadamer tends to repeat himself in some of these essays when you look back in Truth and Method. But he says so many things in a different way, and I think a more compelling way in this essay, making his ties back to Greek philosophy much more evident. So it's just a compelling piece for what it has to say and for its overall place in Gadamer's corpus.
Yeah, great. And yeah, to be able to write something like this at age 92, right, or 90 to 92, to bring things together like this is pretty impressive. I got to ask, what was the other piece? Do you remember? He said there were two.
I think it was the on festival and play, the towards the phenomenology of ritual and language.
No kidding. Okay, great. All right, thanks, Jim. So that gives you an idea of sort of the main focus for today. Richard Palmer, who translated this and wrote the little introduction, has similar views about this, right? Says similar things, that this is one of the standard pieces, one of the classic pieces for Gadamer on aesthetics. So this is how I've opened the other ones. Are there things that you just cannot wait to get into discussing? Things you want to make sure we hit and talk about, that it would be a shame if we left without talking about? They're so important, we just need to start right out with it. Yes, John Arthos.
Okay, yeah, a couple. One is this effort he makes to pull down the boundaries between word and image, right? Which is fascinating, right? And then the other thing is this thing that he does with the absolute, right? And how he relates it to time, right? And then I think the last thing would be this absolute, how he relates to time and to Aristotle's energeia, right? But then also this really interesting thing he does with Vollzug, with this sort of, and he talks about this third species of time, right? And which is sort of this way in which the immediacy of the experience of the Vollzug is this sort of portal, right? So all three of those things are fascinating.
Yeah, that's great. Do you want to? Should we start with the first one? The idea that that when it comes to works of art, rather than dividing up the world between things like poetry, music, perhaps, and then the plastic arts on the other side, what they share in common is what really matters for thinking about art. Right, that's one of the main ideas. Should we start with that, and then we can talk about the absolute and energeia and Vollzug?
So since I mentioned that, I'll throw it out. So of course, this has been his thing all along, and he starts by saying, people have thought it very strange that I began Truth and Method with art, and he said, but that's not strange at all. I mean, he doesn't take it back, right? Right? He makes very clear that he begins and ends Truth and Method on art for a reason, and this thing, he treats all of these different combinations in the course of the essay, including art and science, right? But he starts with this like traditional distinction between art and humanities, and I was looking at the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, and they really had to struggle with this distinction, but he wants to go in the other direction, right? And that's remarkable for a hermeneut, right? Really remarkable. but the whole essay, it's a through line to the whole essay, the way in which, and he gets even more eloquent about this, the need to see these two in relation together, really, in the ways that they work together in terms of transcendence and all that stuff. So to me, that was very important.
Yeah, thanks. So people have thoughts about this. I mean, one thing you could do too is put thoughts in the chat area. If you're not sure about speaking up, you can throw things in the chat, and we can bring those into the conversation as well. Yes, Jim, I see you there. You have to unmute yourself though, because I'm muting people as we go.
I'll follow up, and if I start talking too much today, you can just tell me. I won't be offended.
Sure.
Because I do love this essay so much. But just follow up on what John said. He's clear right here in the beginning of the essay. He reflects back on the place of art in Truth and Method. And it's clear that he's only writing about the humanities because of art. And so when you give a quick read of Truth and Method, you say, oh, it's about the humanities, Truth and Method, about natural science, human sciences. No, he only brings in the humanities because, and he's actually saying the humanities have credence only because of art. I forget exactly in the page if we want to start referencing pages, but basically isn't he saying that? So it's a question back to everyone else. And so it's curious how in Truth and Method, it seems so almost jumbled the way he poses the question of truth and the humanities in effect. And then he begins with art, and you say, why did he begin with art? We know he says that it's an experience of truth, but it seems to get lost as if it was secondary to the issue of the humanities. And no, I think he makes the point in a few sentences in this text.
Oh, we lost you there. What happened? Okay. We didn't hear what you said at the end there, Jim, but here, I've unmuted you again.
We were only talking about, I'm losing everything.
Yeah, there we go.
I only said he's talking about the humanities only because of this priority, the experience of art.
So the main argument is about the truth in art.
Yeah.
And once we can appreciate the truth in art, then it's simple to show that there's truth in the humanities as well, in history. And yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Eric.
Yeah, riffing on that, the way that you said it, Jim, was that he's only looking at the humanities because of art. I thought it was more that because of the kind of instrumentalization of the humanities becoming the social sciences and being evaluated in terms of, right, like a philosophy major, English major, they're always going to be asked the question, what are you going to do with that? Whereas that's never a question for the students who major in chemistry or something like that. And so how do we legitimize or justify or save the humanities in terms of evaluating them in light of the natural sciences? That's how I was kind of understanding it, less that he only talked about humanities because of art. I thought that's how you were saying it, Jim, and maybe I'm mishearing you.
Well, maybe I slightly exaggerated the point then, but I don't think he's making your argument explicitly there. I mean, certainly that comes up, and in other essays, he's making just exactly what you said, Nathan, Eric. But I was just trying to refer to what's being said in artwork and word and image.
Yeah, Andrew.
I think that's the case, but he doesn't exclude scientific research either as participating in this experience of art. And I've been trying to find the exact paragraph. Maybe somebody can help me out on that.
So say more of what you mean. I remember him talking about that scientific, just like he'll say for say history, that a kind of scientific approach to history isn't going to get us to what really matters for doing history. So too, a scientific approach to art is not going to get us to what really matters with art. So if somebody had a theory about poetry where they said what really matters is a certain rhyme scheme, a certain use of imagery at a certain time, and so on. We got page 200. Thanks, Sharon. That's not really going to be that's not going to get us to what's essential.
Yeah, I think he's got a nuanced understanding of science. It comes out in two places.
Okay.
One is a reference to statistics and quantum theory in comparison to the Pythagoreans and Aristotle's physics. That was an interesting comparison. And then also there is this specifically, I understand what you're saying, David, but also this reference to scientific research being comparable to the experience of art, something along those lines. He doesn't develop it, but he drops it in there. And it's too bad. I looked at it an hour ago, and maybe it's, but it looks like other people have their hands
it's
up.
page 395 in the German.
Okay, good.
It says specifically art and science, and he distinguishes art and science as a pair from the more practical, technical, vocational learning. Right? That's where he's elevating science. Atypical for him. That's on. I can find the English, but it's on 395 in the German.
Thanks.
Don.
It goes back a little bit, but just to Jim's point, which I think is correct. He also says that it is that art has a prestige. The experience of art has a prestige, which the humanities can't take for granted. I mean, he starts with art because we can't deny the power of art. We can sort of deny the humanities in relation to the sciences because we're so dominated by the sciences, but art has a power that's undeniable. So in a sense, the humanities need it because they rely on the power of art to give validity to their kind of study as opposed to scientific study. So I think art is doubly important. The humanities are important because they deal with art and are close to it. And the humanities are validated by the experience of art. Yeah, ultimately.
Okay, Lorenzo, and again, the page for Andrew is on page 200 for Andrew's reference, if you haven't got that yet.
Yeah, to go back to Andrew's question, I think the affinity between art and science has to do with, but they're both residing in the neighborhood of theoria. That is to say, that is a separation from utility. That's the affinity between the sciences and art, as Gadamer sees it. So I think his theoria is the mediation for him there.
Yeah. Andrew, does that sound right?
Not in the particular passage. I think that's sort of an extrapolation a bit from the text, but it does make sense. He's going to close down the separation between theoria or spectator and participant pretty clearly. Mm-hmm. And that's true in the experience of art. It's true of experience in general for Gadamer. I wouldn't say experience of art. It's true of experience in science, experience in religion and philosophy. So what he's really unpacking here is not experience of art, I would say, but just the nature of experience, which I think is rooted in his understanding of nature.
So, Andrew, I have a quick question about this view. If that's the case, then have we lost the special place of art? It seems like he wants to say that art holds a special place. Or is it just that art helps us to see better the nature of experience, where it's not as obvious in other areas?
I think he says that in our times, art has a special place that's been elevated as a result of the sciences. So aesthetics, the romantics have come to the fore in our view because the old world view where art had a place, the Middle Ages and ancient times, is no longer there, where they existed in a world and in a context that would not call them into question, would not elevate them into the beyond. But now the experience of art has been elevated into the beyond as a result of our historical situation, the Enlightenment. Okay.
But you wouldn't say there's a specific kind of experience called an aesthetic experience that we only get from art and don't get anywhere else in our lives. Like that's true. Some people in aesthetics want to say that sort of thing. You must say that's not the case, right?
No.
Okay. Eric.
I was just going to add to the comments there with Andrew that when we say the aesthetic experience, are we talking about the one that he criticized about the subjectivization of it? And that's part of the romantic picture, right? Versus the, like you were saying, the contextualized experience of art. But I wanted to go back to Don's comment, and this relates to what everybody's saying with regard to art. When Gadamer's talking about art, he's talking about high art, or, you know, like, I'm trying to think of other ways to put it, but like Hegel talking about art, religion, and philosophy are the highest domains of spirit, right? Like on the end of the essay on page 224, he starts talking about the panels. I think about like icons in Greek Orthodox or Russian Orthodox Christianity, where you see the panels and you're kind of invited into the experience. And I was at this presentation where the argument was that panels are the true form, that comic books or comics are just a mere derivative distortion of the true power of the panel art. And I was thinking it might be better well, I was wondering how Gadamer would respond to that. Would he have that same, what I would think would be a prejudice against low art, right? Like the comic versus the panel, you know? And the reason why I'm concerned about this is because I'm getting more and more involved with cultural studies, and a lot of my students are really interested in analyzing comics and anime and things like this. And so thinking about the experience of the work of art in those domains, and not only in high art. Yeah,
good point. So just so everyone is clear what all is on the table right now, some of the topics that we're going to look forward to talking to about the next hour and a half. This one is about whether there is a strong distinction between high art and low art, fine art and handicrafts. Maybe it's another distinction, but parallel. There's a question about whether art gives us different experiences from the sciences and other areas of life that Andrew brought up. And then there are the three that were brought up in the beginning, the question about whether different forms of art all provide at core the same sort of experience. And what matters is what they have in common, not the ways in which we experience them differently, the ways in which art is absolute, or the experience of art is absolute, and the temporal character of art, and then that key recovery of Erasmus and connecting it to Vollzug. So there's five we can focus on. Right now we've got sort of Eric's in front of us, and I know, John Arthos, you put something in the chat about decorative arts. Did you want to say something more about that?
Yeah, because in Truth and Method in here, he's trying to redeem art from its aestheticization, right, and give it the stature that it deserves from his perspective, and so what he's really trying to do is any art that. So this is in response to that, any art that can be raised to this higher function, which is like the whole essay. I mean, a big part of the whole essay is relating art to Aristotle's metaphysics, right? That's what he's trying to do. He's trying to bring art up from its lowly place, the typical place where it's regarded as just a practical, something that people create, to this thing that helps us understand our lives and truth and wisdom and knowledge, all these things. It deserves to be at least as high as any other, maybe what you're saying, David, even higher, or the highest. But in any case, that's how it gets to theoria. It is equivalent to theoria, the experience of art.
Okay, Don.
Just take the issue of comic books or anime. People around me are crazy about anime. From the side of the consumer of the art of anime, and it is an art, from the side of the consumer, my experience is that most of them are sort of enjoying the anime in order to live in the world that the anime creates, to imagine adventures, to imagine supernatural beings, things like that. Okay, so they're absorbed into the story and the characters and what they are. And that, I think, is for him not quite art. And on the other side, on the part of someone who examines it, someone may be interested in anime or comics as an indication of the influence of Japanese culture in America, or why young people like this and older people don't, or something like that, which is kind of a sociological question or something like that. But if you, I think you're right that Gadamer has this strong and obvious passion for high art, for what we think of as the high art, high Western art. But any work of art, no matter how simple, if you were to start exhibiting comic books in a gallery as art, you would be doing to them, you would be raising them into the sphere of what he's talking about with art in general. So even though I certainly agree he prefers high art, no question about that, nevertheless, I think the thing applies to any work of art taken as a work of art, not as a medium for living one's life or as an example of a sociological phenomenon, but taking it for art as art. It would also, what you would be doing would be the same thing you're doing when you take Rembrandt as art. Okay, I think. Okay.
I think you'd want to say, let me just, or maybe I'll put this as a question to you, Don. Do you think that anything can be taken as a work of art? Because my sense is when Gadamer talks about energeia, which we usually translate as actualize or activity, but to actualize that when we are properly experiencing it as a work of art, we are actualizing its artistic power. And so he thinks something is present in the work that then is actualized by our engagement with it. And it's not clear to me that everything has that sort of capacity to begin with. So I would think you could take panels from anime, or you could have Roy Lichtenstein, who does pop art versions of cartoon panels. And I'm not sure that, but I'm not sure it's the case that anything can be elevated into a work of art. But I'd ask you, is it just a matter of taking the artistic attitude towards something?
Well, not quite.
Okay.
Okay. So, yeah, or you could take the first thing that your eye falls on that day, say a pickaxe in the window of a hardware store, which you take home and set up in your studio and say, that's my work of art for today, as Duchamp did. Okay.
Yeah,
Famously.
right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So two things here. One is art exists in its, I think he's saying, I found this very, I mean, this is a hard essay. I had a lot of problems with it. I'm just not sure I understand it really. Art has its being in Vollzug, in performance, in presentation, in, you know, okay. So you can't say, well, this object has in itself a feature that distinguishes art from all other objects, all non-art objects. That's not quite the way it works. Okay. So I don't think he would say that Duchamp had in fact made it a work of art. Now, what is it when you do that? These are these odd expressions he uses. Zoistus. You look at it and you say, that's right.
Yeah.
That somehow in itself, just the way it is right. It has exact measure. It has proportion of whatever, this weird thing he gets from Plato of exact measure, you know, it's so puzzling to me. But if you're looking at it that way, so Duchamp looks at that pickaxe and says, Zoistus, you know, it becomes it's a work of art. You're taking it as a work of art.
Yeah.
I think, you know.
All right, great. Lorenzo.
Yeah, well, I think that there is a kind of an ambivalence towards popular art. I mean, on Gadamer's side, I mean, there are a couple of points. And sometimes I actually thought of Adorno. For Adorno, it wasn't so much pop art that he was against. It was sort of not non-authentic in some sense. But he talks about what was called the Verfremdungs effect, the sort of the estrangement effect. That's very important for Gadamer. And also, he was concerned about disintegrating the aura of the work, where he actually really his position should be contrasted with Benjamin's. I mean, Gadamer wants to somehow retain that aura. So it seems to me that if sort of the art in the age of mechanical reproduction, the Benjamin point, is undermining the aura, then that way of thinking about art for Gadamer is problematic. So I think there's a tension. There's an ambivalence, genuine ambivalence on his part with regard to popular art. I mean, it's hard to reconcile. It seems art has to challenge our expectations, right? And one way of thinking about popular art is that, at least in music, is that it doesn't do that. So yeah.
Yeah. Okay. For those who don't know the Benjamin piece, he talks about the way that photography transformed art. So now we can have many copies, identical copies of the same thing, and we lose the idea that there was an original sacred first one, which we have to own or be present to in order to have the experience of art. And then his thought was, once we break that magical religious leftover, we'll also realize the same is true with lots of other artworks too, that this was a leftover idea that there's something sacred about the original and being in the presence of the original. But Gadamer really wants to say, no, there is something, if not sacred, something important about being present and tearing with a work of art. That's part of what you're saying, right, Lorenzo?
Yeah.
The contrast. Yeah.
Yeah.
Jim.
Yes, I wanted to say that I agree with mostly what Don was saying, except at the very end. So yes, Gadamer actually defines art as Vollzug there, and everything depends on seeing exactly what that term then means. But at the end of and I thought that comments reflecting about the difference between high art and other art is quite germane. But you could also add to that Gadamer talks about non-representational art as well. So I think you see, especially in Truth and Method, an emphasis or talking more about high art. But I don't think, as Don said quite well, it's really about all art, even abstract art, and how much it gets into something more culturally specific. I'm not sure he'd grant, but maybe he would, that graffiti would be art as well. So then it comes back to asking, well, what then is art? And art is in Vollzug, but I could say, well, following his hermeneutics generally, it's that which has something to say. So I'll let art be defined precisely when there is something there that has something to say, which doesn't mean I have to make strict categories, whether it's high or low or whatever.
Right.
But in relation to that, this is where I wanted to go with the comment. The only thing I was not sure about what Don said, when you said the so it is, that's really not the mark of art so much as the mark of truth. It's this, if I use the word intuitive, it's misleading, but you can't logically make a movement to art. You can't trace the movement of truth by saying, I see this and I see that and then I see that. So there is no linkage for truth, but there is, like the way he talked about the beautiful in Truth and Method, linking it to that almost the spark, the luminosity, where something just shows up. And the so it is that experience where it comes forth. And I'm reading, but I can't necessarily trace my steps to explain how that truth came about. But in that way, I think that fits with Lorenzo was just saying about it challenges your expectations, because it's the whole thing about, yeah, you learn something. There's something there, and you see something now perhaps differently that you never saw before.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. I'm wondering, one of the categories, Jim, if I can keep you on the hook here, one of the ways people divide up the arts is the performing arts from other forms of art, and there's performance art, and even Gadamer talks about when you're addressing poetry, you should read it aloud, you perform it. But and obviously it applies to music and theater, but does it make sense to talk about it in the same way when we're talking about paintings or sculptures? Is the performance, he talks about the way you have to constantly move around in front of a painting and find the spots that then things start to open up for you. Mm-hmm. Is that what we'd say is the performance that's connected to the event of truth in a painting? Or, does it make sense to talk about performance in the arts, which we usually don't talk about as performing arts, like the static arts.
Yes, but I would probably shift my language slightly because I like to translate Vollzug as enactment. And when you say performance, it comes too close. Well, we have this distinction within the performing arts. And why I want enactment, because I'm shifting away from your question a little, David. This is why I think this text is so important, because Aristotle is clearly at work. And what's at work that you don't see in some of the other essays, although he's not too far from it, is the idea of energeia, which, as you know, in this Latinization of the Greek, energeia becomes actuality, as if it's an accomplished reality. But Gadamer is very clear in this essay pointing out the way, and Heidegger gets this too, energeia is a special term by Aristotle to indicate the very dynamic of reality. So energeia is always an actualizing actuality. And it's that sense that I think the Vollzug is going to be tied to. So it's not performance per se, that's dance, theater, and so on, but it's the enactment of meaning. Okay. That the example of painting then you gave is perfect. Gadamer does say at one place, you stand at a right place where that art comes into view, as if it is always something that's being experienced. And in the experience, the issue is, so it is, when that moment when, aha, there I see what's going on.
Okay. Do you think that translating energeia as Vollzug then helps us understand something better about energeia? We stop thinking of it as something very static, but understand it now as something that's enacting.
I also say we can just stay with actuality as long as we don't think in the Latinization of it, that it's, and we all know this from our first course in philosophy. Aristotle relates actuality to potentiality and actuality. So there's the element of becoming, but becoming is not set against being.
Right.
That's the whole issue of that Gadamer makes clear about the term energeia. It's not a doubling between the something static and something in movement.
Right.
That reality is this coming into itself, which is the character of life. It's always movement.
Yeah, good, great. Lorenzo.
Yeah, this is a passage that complicates the issue of what counts as art for Gadamer, for me. On page 202, about the middle of the page, says, an artist, even if he or she uses mechanical means of production, constructs something that is for itself and is there only to be contemplated. This is one allows an artwork to be exhibited, and precisely then is it a work. Suggesting that there's something about the intention of the artist that determines whether or not something is a work of art. And also, there's certain elements of what is now called the institutional theory of art. Namely, if something is constructed in order to be exhibited, it counts as art. So there is that kind of that pole. That's not the thing per se, but the intention that determines it. And that's a kind of, for me, again, it complicates the picture of what Gadamer is counting as a work. Yeah.
Right. No, that's a good point. And it's surprising to have both those together, because you would think the one advantage of the institutional theory is we don't have to worry about intentions anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
We take an ancient clay pot and stick it in a museum, and good, it's art now. It doesn't matter whether the person intended to be art or not, or had any sort of cultural conception of art.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Thanks. Yeah. Eric.
What's the German word that's being translated as contemplative or contemplation? And are there any other connotations of that word that maybe aren't captured by contemplation? Because the contemplation gets sounds religiously loaded to me, and it also kind of returns to the romantic subjectivization. Like, who does the contemplation? It's the individual still alienated from the work working on you. Contemplation suggests a distance to me. I don't know.
So I see contemplated on page 11 and contemplative on 22. Was there other places? If I'm going to track down the German, I need to find out where this is in English.
I'm looking at the line that Lorenzo just read to us on page 202.
202, there it is. Okay.
Yeah, and it's right in the middle of the page. That the work of the artist constructs something that is for itself and is there only to be contemplated. And that's what I'm asking, if there's other connotations of the German word translated there.
Has anyone tracked that down yet? Do we have a page number in the German yet?
What was that page in the English, Eric?
202. 202.
202. Thank you.
While we're looking for it, I just want to say Palmer took some liberties in the translation of this text.
Mhm.
I like Palmer, he's dedicated, but by I mean liberties, he added some words that, that aren't there, and the headings, it's all introduced by Palmer. So we do have to be careful about some of the translations.
I think it's page 379.
Yeah, I just threw it in the chat. It's 379, and it's für eine Betrachtung da ist, for a considering is there.
Oh, für ein Betrachten.
Okay.
But I was gonna
So
just maybe add for on the Lorenzo point. I think the thought here is that the artist, the intention is relevant so far as the thing is not, the artwork is not made for a purpose, right? But rather for this betrachting, for the beholding or contemplating, the considering. Of course, he's going to kind of walk that back a little bit because architecture is a little bit trickier, but nevertheless, it's there also always for this betrachten. That I say that intentionality is different from what the meaning of the artwork is, and there I think the intention of the artist isn't relevant.
Okay, Don.
Just let me ask the question whether contemplation, as he's using it there, is like theoria as he's using it on 213. So on 213, he sort of says that theoria, we're close to theoria here, and theoria is being, it's toward the bottom of 213. It's being fully there, which is the highest form of activity in reality. One needs both words. So the idea here is that if you're fully there and participating, it's in a way that allows a deity, allows the divine to manifest itself physically. I mean, in your body. Yeah, you feel it all the way into your body. And that allowing it to be there is not something you do as a sort of willful act, but something that it's your experience of it. So I'm wondering whether contemplation and theoria are kind of closely conjoined in his way of thinking about it. He could call it contemplation at one time, but theoria at another, and that takes it off to a way in which truth is important, not just beauty.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. What do we think, Jim?
Okay. Yeah, you have to be careful with both those words in English as we ordinarily understand them, theory and contemplation. I think Carlo was right, was giving us, it's more like the Beobachten is more about a consideration. But the theoria, Gadamer says this someplace too. The initial sense of the Greek word theoria has to do with the theros. The theros is one that left the city to observe a religious celebration, pageantry, and returned to the city to talk about it. So if you look in Plato's Republic, it's all about journey from beginning, middle to end, and it's all about the theoretical life in that sense. And so Gadamer links theoria, he keeps that sense alive. That theoria is not what we mean at distance, looking at something, speculation, but to the specular, which is to look and to see something. So to really be there at it, like the theros, you're observing and you're at it, and ultimately that means in the fullness for Gadamer. And so we don't want to take contemplation either in that stronger sense that we normally think of it as just stepping back and thinking about something.
So I was, if I can bring this up, I was puzzled by the way he connected together that you see something, it is right, there it is true. There is this somewhat cognitive element to, there's a truth to the experience. But then he says things like on 2:16 that what came forth and how it came forth cannot be put into words. And he says a little lower that it's something one has never experienced in exactly this way before. So I wonder why. I mean, certainly you cannot sum up the meaning of work of art in words. But why, if you have this experience and it's true and it's right, why can't we say, this is what it means? This is what it said to me. This is what it revealed to me. Especially if it's something you know that it's not something you've experienced in the same way before. It feels like he's playing between, on one hand, this very aesthetic, it's emotional, transcendent experience, and then a very more cognitive, no, there's a truth that is realized and recognized here. And trying to have it both ways. And I'm more sympathetic to the truth side, that we learn something, we discover something. We discover something about war by looking at Picasso's Guernica that we would never get by reading about war. But we should be able to say, yes, this is what it is about war that I now understand that I didn't understand before. If we're able to say, and I didn't understand it before. Does that make sense? Eric?
Yeah, that's awesome. What you're raising is awesome. Like if you keep going down on that paragraph, the last line is, this is not the kind of assertion that the artwork makes. So I wonder if when he's saying it cannot be put into words, that words there are words in the sense of the kind of philosophy of language that's representational. Like it can't be a descriptive expression to label what you know, although the work of art, Guernica or whatever, might actually, you might have a lot of poetry pouring out of you or a lot of dialogue pouring out of you, but you're not going to be able to just simply assert what it is that you know. Is maybe something like that he's equivocating on the word there by not being able to put it into these sorts of words. I don't know.
I want to be able to say that if you realize it as a truth, you also recognize there's a way of putting it into words. Because art can lie as well. I mean, not just in Plato's sense, but in the sense that a painting by de Kooning may say women are awful. And it's like, this is what the work is saying, and this is not a message that we recognize as true. It's something like, it seems like in order to say that there's a truth that comes forth, that's right, we have to be able to, at some level, the truth has to hit us in a way we can say something about it. But maybe I've just got a too intellectual picture here. Carlo, you want to get in there? You haven't been in a while.
Yeah, happily. I think Gadamer's not, I don't think he's saying that you can't put it into words. I think the thought is that the truth that emerges in the enactment of the artwork is a truth that's brought to presentation only by it, such that you couldn't say, oh, yeah, it's just for representing this other truth that we know from elsewhere, right? It's confirming something we already could observe elsewhere in the world. That's why I think he then goes on in that very paragraph to talk about, right, certainly it is not the thing that has been copied that comes forth, right? So that you could then refer back to the copied thing, the original, to which it's referring. So it's like the idea, I think, is that you can articulate what's true in the artwork, but the truth that's manifested there in a way sort of gives us a way to better see the rest of the world, not to see the rest of the world as it were, like confirming, or a way to, the world is not the thing that, the rest of the world is not the world that corroborates what we find in the artwork. Rather, it's the truth of the artwork that allows us to see the rest of the world in some more truthful way.
Okay, I can see that. Jim?
Yeah, I think Carlos is spot on, and just that. I was just going to add, you were overreading it when I would say that it's a question of the how the truth came about can't be explained, but not, you can't say and discuss the meaning that is present there.
Fair enough.
Carlos said it quite well.
Appreciate that. Lorenzo? Sorry, I muted myself. Lorenzo, go ahead.
Yeah, the part of the truth of the work is that it discloses, and it discloses in such a way that it reconfigures the, in a sense, it reconfigures the world as you knew it. Your vocabulary is adequate to the world as you knew it. So the vocabulary that you would use to articulate what you learned isn't adequate to it. So it's in that sense that right, the world that corresponds to your taken for granted vocabulary it's in part what's been disrupted by the work, and in that sense, that vocabulary that you use to talk about it is no longer adequate in a certain way. I mean, it's a bit of an extreme way to put it, but that's sort of the.
So what do you make on 214? He says that at the end of the long paragraph, he says, everything that has to do with our own meaning and own opining seems to disappear. It seems like if the work challenged us in that way, it's because of our own meanings, our own opinions, our own views, that we have this transformation. So I don't know, it was surprised me when he said everything about you disappears in the experience of the work of art. Because it seems to me that it only works to challenge you in this way, to take you out of where you are, if where you are is brought to the experience.
So it's a determinate negation. And if it's a determinate negation, you should be able to say, well, I'd learned that it's not that.
Okay.
If nothing else, yeah, right?
Okay, fair enough. Yep.
Yeah.
Jim, do you want to get back in here? No. Okay, you're muted anyway, so Don, go ahead.
Well, just as on the text on 214, the point of his remark there is not that everything you are and your experiences are put aside. The point there is that you're not imposing your view on the artwork.
Right.
You know, you're interpreting it. Okay. But to the point about whether you can articulate this experience of the work of art, I would point, for instance, to poems where poets respond to works of art.
Mm-hmm.
You know, ekphrastic poems in general. Okay. Clearly, there is a sense in the poet's responsiveness to the work of art that he's put it into another work of art.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And those are words and those are articulate, you know, and interpretation. I mean, he says, you know, that the work of art is the interpretation. The Vollzug of the work is the interpretation. And we do try to articulate our interpretations all the time. And we do that all the time. Okay. Mm-hmm. Though not in a definitive way that then cannot be changed. You know, I mean, that is, it changes over with different people and over the course of time. Interpretation is endless and endlessly open. But yes, we do put in words our experience of the work of art. Great art critics do this constantly. That's why you read them.
Yeah.
Because they help you to understand the work of art. But they aren't, I think the point is right. These are not propositions. These are not Aussage. Zusatz, they're not right. Aussagesatz, you know, they're not propositional statements.
Yeah, good. Henry, Thanks for joining
Yeah,
the conversation.
Yeah, just to add to Don's point, I think the on 214 where it says that we should not focus on the subjective. We have to go back to in truth of method where he said in the experience of the play, where the subject of the play is not the individual player, not the subjects, but the whole participation of the players, the game itself, and the spectators. So here, the subjective experience melting away of not mattering anymore is actually to take a more holistic picture. So it's not just the individual subject, but the whole enterprise of the artists, of the spectators of the art itself. And another thing about the how Gadamer is very deliberately trying to keep the what shines forth, what comes out, to keep it vague. So he's very deliberately trying to he put double quote around the it, so it comes out, it shines forth, but he's very deliberately to keep it vague. I'm not sure how much it is appropriate, but I think this is a very phenomenological, like kind of like in Heidegger, right? When we hold a tool, we can see immediately what it is, but sometimes there's another meaning that can come forth. But in Heidegger, it seems to be the user is quite passive, right? You are thrown into it. But I think in some sense, Gadamer is kind of like a corrective to that point of view. So he focused on artwork. In artwork, it seems that it's a little bit more balanced. We are not just thrown into it. We walk around the artwork, we walk around the statues, we are actively participating in creating its meaning. So that what comes forth is we're not sure, we don't know yet, but it's something, once it comes forth, it's kind of like in Heidegger's origin of artwork, right? All the six different things comes together. So like I think this is one point in Gadamer that he is vague, but I think it's a good point that he's keeping it deliberately vague.
Okay. Would you say in general, you called it the meaning at one point, that's basically what he's talking about, is there has to be this interaction, and this as well as this action, a meaning will emerge from the work, but it's vague as to what that is going to be, and often you don't know where it came from, or you can't tell beforehand what that is going to be, except for in the play, in the participation.
Yeah, and I think that's why he keeps stressing on the anageia, right? Is the meaning is not set in stone. It's always depends on all of these different factors together.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Henry. John, Arthos.
Yeah, I think both Henry's points are exactly right, and I think that helps address the problem that you had about subjectivity, and Eric had about subjectivity, and about this notion of interpretation. Because the examples he's using of interpretation in this essay are very clearly not the critic interpreting a poem or opining about a piece of music. The examples he uses, there's this beautiful passage where he talks about the way in which a musician performs a piece of work, or he also talks about the way a poem is recited. And so these are performance. So the actualization of the work continues. It's no longer just the text, right? So in that way, we are all contributing in our subjective experience and in our lives. We're contributing by participation in the work. So this is this Greek notion of participation, right? So he wants to dissolve these dichotomous boundaries between subject and object, person and work. So interpretation in this context is more this ongoing so this is what Jim is saying about, I think it's what Jim is about actualization. It really is a kind of ongoing performativity of the work that we're all participating in.
Yeah, great. Thanks, John. Cynthia.
Yeah, to follow up a little bit on what John said, it seems like Volzug is, trying to emphasize or highlight the complex temporality of the artwork. And he uses other terms like verweilen, link to linger or lingering, die Weile. And so I'm wondering how those three relate to each other, and how here his emphasis on Volzug, how that maybe be like perhaps an advancement, what it's adding differently. That's the first part. The second part is on page 218, he uses Gestalt and form Gestalt. It's translated as design. And in that passage where he talks about that, it's the first paragraph, I was expecting him to say Gebilde. And so I'm wondering, is this a new sort of emphasis that he has, or what's the relationship between form Gestalt and Gebilde? So those are my two questions.
Wow. Okay, so we have one about the temporality of work of art, right, in Tyrian, Verweile, and one about why he talks about Gestalt rather than Gebilde. We have thoughts on that?
Can I answer that
Yeah.
one? I think that gets to the heart of it for me, and it goes back to what I think he's really doing here with this notion of the absolute, because I think he's trying to find sort of so first of all, the absolute is a very sort of antithetical to the whole sort of thrust of hermeneutic understanding, which is historical, right? But what he does here, I think, is try to recuperate it by saying what the human version of it is. And so that's where I think he not only gives us not a third species of being, this, zum Werden, but this third species of time. And that's the fascinating thing. And so I think it's sort of implicit in Truth and Method when he starts to talk about, before he gets rid of the Erlebnis, which he doesn't like, he grabs its temporal significance, which is a relationship of part to whole. In the moment of an Erlebnis, you grasp the whole, even though it's only a part. And the same thing happens here. I mean, he gets really close in this essay to describing really the modernist epiphany. So this is the new piece to me, which is that this immediacy of the Vollzug is a portal to the whole, right? So that in the immediacy of the moment, we can, for a moment, grasp the whole. And so in the English translation on page 217, he lists a whole bunch of different ways the Vollzug really is. So here's the list: how it begins, ends, how it lasts, how it remains in one's mind, and in the end, it fades away, and yet somehow remains with us and can surface again. Well, if you think about that, that's everything. That's all of time, right? But never present to you at the same moment, except in the immediacy of the experience. That's the so it is for me. That's the human version of the absolute, because it gives you access. And so the artwork is this sort of portal to all these temporal registers that somehow, to the extent that we can, bring it all together.
That was really helpful. Thank you.
Are I muted? Carlo.
I want to chime in really quickly about what I think Greg and I were worried about, this question about the distinction or relationship between Gestalt and Gebilde. And I think we kind of drew the following conclusion that like the Gestalt type talk, I think is sort of common to anything, like anything that involves play and therefore a kind of structure, kind of normatively structured behavior. And I think Gadamer likes to use the term Gebilde to refer to the Gestalt that's distinctive of artworks. I think he likes to use it because of the build that's in the German there. But that was our hypothesis, and I think it's been reasonably well borne out by it as we've come across it in Gadamer's writings. But anyway, that's what we think. So a Gebilde is a Gestalt, but it's just the way he talks about the Gestalt of artworks.
Did it again. There we go. I hope that helps, Cynthia. John Arthos, did you want to get back in on something else?
No,
Raise your hand.
I agree. I agree with. I just said to me the gestalt, the form is temporalized in hermeneutics, right? It's not a form; it's the structuring or the forming. Just as we've been saying with all these other concepts, is that they don't exist at any one moment as a thing, as an object. They are enacted over the course of our lives, over our histories.
Do we want to say a little bit more about the place of time in the piece? This is one of the original topics that John Arthos brought out, both in the way we experience works of art and also works of art having a certain absolute status. Jim, do you want to speak to that, or is it something else?
It is something else, but I will speak to it. I wish Niall Keane was in here today because he gave that paper on speaking about the temporality. Clearly, with the experience is always temporal, and Cynthia and others have talked about this experience for Weiland and the whole notion of what it means to tarry in about empty and fulfilled time. I am less certain about John's comments about how the artwork expresses a certain temporality. And even when Niall presented his paper, I wasn't sure exactly how this eternity or this absoluteness of time is there in the work of art. I understand fulfilled time as that moment where you, to use almost my expression from the 1960s, you're one with it in a way. There's no distance, so as if time can no longer even be measured. But I don't know about, so I wait for others to add comments about the actual temporality of the work.
So there is discussion of Gleichzeitigkeit, right?
Can I quickly add there? Most of us know this. This is Kierkegaard's contemporaneity.
Right.
And
yeah, no, say more, because a lot of people, I'm sure, many people don't know much about it.
well, the easiest way I always explain it, even when teaching, is to say, so here's Kierkegaard trying to talk about being a Christian and Christianity. And the whole idea of, well, like the Crusades, you go back to go to the tomb of Christ, and then I'll have the reality of Christ there. And for Kierkegaard, no, it's not that at all. It's not the idea of leaping over time.
Mm-hmm.
And the whole idea then to be contemporaneous with Christ is that, in Gadamerian language, kind of a fusion of horizons, where you are one with it. So it's where the past is present, in effect. And so it's holding the distance that time naturally involves. It's suspending it in a way.
Would you say that is the temporal structure of Volkszug when we encounter a work of art from a different time, a different period, and it speaks to us? The temporal structure we're talking about is a contemporaneity now. The work is made present in the present, speaks to us in the present. We're not returning to ancient Greece to read this. It's now present to us.
Yes, but that's bringing back all the issues that he fully developed in talking about the historical in Truth and Method. I think the same way he explained it there, that's why he's not changing his position here.
Yeah.
So again, I retreat back. I understand the difference between empty and fulfilled time in Gadamer. And I think that experience of meaning comes with the fulfilled time, but I wouldn't call it anything mystical. I would say it's where you're one with it. That is, you're not letting the distance of the ordinary, and the critic is always taking a distance from the work. And what Gadamer wants to talk about for the hermeneutic of understanding. At that moment when you see something, you're not at a distance from what it is. It's
Yeah.
just like the experience of reading. You're not distinguishing yourself from what you're reading at a certain point when you're reading. And that's that coming together.
Okay, great. Lorenzo.
Yeah, in a way, it's a footnote to what Jim just said. And back to Kierkegaard, like this distinction between empty time and fill time, I think, and for Kierkegaard from either or in other places, Kierkegaard draws a distinction between external history and internal history. And so the sort of the empty time is sort of external history, where time is relatively indifferent. What's of concern is what is the actual product, what comes at the end. So the time between you and that is, kind of indifferent, empty time. But when significance is immanent, that's for Kierkegaard, that's internal history. And I think this, in a way, I'm sort of saying it again. I think what Jim was saying. It's the immanence of significance that counts as an internal history or fill time. So it seems to be a very Kierkegaardian theme that he's going out here.
I have, I'll get to you in a second, Don. I've got I have a big question. I'm not in a position to answer it, but it's on my mind when I read this, because I know that for Heidegger argued that Eragnus for Aristotle is the point in which we understand him as belonging to the metaphysics of presence. That by thinking of Eragnus as being, that is now Aristotle's metaphysics of presence. He's part of the tradition who thinks of metaphysics this way. And so part of me has wondered in the background here, by revitalizing Eragnus and giving this different conception of time connected to it, rather, is Gadamer trying to save Aristotle from Heidegger's criticism? That's a very big question, maybe best left for Heidegger scholars. But I wonder whether Heidegger's discussion of Eragnus as presence and the metaphysics of presence is in the background here. But I'm just putting that out there. Not that I think we're going to be able to answer it on the spot. But Don, go ahead.
Wow. That's so interesting. But just as footnote or a side note, I think it shows you're right that there are ways in which Gadamer is carefully taking some distance from Heidegger, especially later in his career, so that there are points where he's not quite, he's sort of Heidegger, okay, Heidegger, but not quite. Okay. On this question of time, I thought, just to add some text, 210, on page 210, he talks about tarrying, okay, or lingering. Lingering might be better than tarrying, but I understand why he says tarry. He says he's pointing to the imminent temporality of its duration, of the artwork's duration. Imminent significance, I thought, was just right, but imminent temporality of its duration, not a one after another sequence, but an at the same timeness of the temporal structure of tarrying that an artwork possesses. Okay. And I think that's connected to his discussion at the beginning of the essay about presence, because he says about presence, and this is on 198, the present, the future is already there. Presence is oriented toward the future as what awaits and what is waiting for us. It's also oriented toward the past as the horizon of the past, and yet it isn't the past. It isn't lost in memory. It's here, and it sort of leads him up to a conclusion that I found odd, so I want to ask a question about. On 199, he just says, the absolute presence of art to all times and places. But he does that in the context of saying some art is very alien to us. It's very hard for us to make it present, even though he insists that we can. And I'm puzzled by that, because some art from other places and other times really is very alien, and I'm not sure we do. Is that right? That there is an absolute presence of art that is always accessible to us? So one question is, that's the absolute presence of art. But then the second question is, okay, that's what art is when we experience it as art. But is that really always available with works of art from other times and cultures?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I'm not sure we need to ask that about other times and cultures, because there's things that go on in the art world that are very foreign to lots of people. See your reactions on, right? Such that he talks so much about having to learn to be able to experience these things. And if you have to do so much work to have to be able to put in a position to actually have the kind of experience we're looking for, then is it really the case that they're absolutely available to all times? Yeah, I think that's a really good question. John Arthos, do you want to speak to that, or do you want to speak to something else?
Well, on the time still, I'm still on the time, because I think this, I mean, in this reference to Christ is probably his primary example of this. I think in the background, the Christ event, the typology of Christian history is this repetition, right? This pre, John the Baptist, and then after Christ, it resonates. His birth resonates history. So on page, the German is 398, and it's the second to the last page. He actually says, he pairs Absolutheit and Gleichzeitigkeit as a pair. And then he introduces a word which I actually think is his German version of energeia. And he only uses it once in the essay, and Palmer actually does, quote the German word. And in the English text, it's on page 213. It's Geistesgegenwart. So, it is something that we only have access to in the immediacy, in the imminent moment, but it gives us access to this. It's not an eternal present, because that would be the thing that he's turning away from, right? That's what he was saying, that the absolute, in the notion of Hegelian absolute, the absolute knowledge, or a Christian notion of the absolute in this sort of second world, this other world, or the Greek notion of mathematical truth. It's this other human presentness that is actualized in these moments that give us access.
Oops, sorry. Good. Yeah. Actualize in this moment. It was excellent. Good. Yeah, Henry.
Yeah, so it seems the reference to the absolute self, at least maybe a few functions, maybe I can add the few that I think I observed. So one thing is he wants to utilize the Hegelian's notions that the absolutes include everything, because for Hegel, right, is the Geist, is a spirit, the world spirit that runs along the logic until it accumulates to the absolute, and the absolute includes everything beforehand, includes all of the antinomy before. So like it is this notion of including everything else. So like how he repeats it, how the art is the creation, the performance, every performance is the presentation of the art. So this notion of absolute lets Gadamer more easily says how the art is not one particular instant in time, but it's accumulation of all of this together. And another thing that I noticed that is the connection between this concept of absolute to his own thinking on the relation between the beauty and the truth. How Hegel's the absolute is the truth. Gadamer doesn't agree with this, but in some sense, by saying that the art is absolute, he's kind of metaphorically saying that how the beautiful is the truth. Because for him, there's a long passage where he says that the Plato is misunderstood, right? When Plato says art is tries removed because it's a copy of a copy. So in a sense that because we understood copying as the production of truth, and Gadamer says, oh, this is a misunderstood part of Plato, because what is important is the unconsumment, the coming forth of the beauty. Beauty is not about copying. It's about the something that is naturally coming out of, like, so that's why he makes that connection between the nature and art. And so the way I mean, like, maybe strategically he uses the Hegelian words absolute, is also hinting at his reformulation of how we think about truth. So like how Hegel's criticize the notion of truth, Gadamer is also criticizing the notion of truth through this notion of art. So I think that's 2 points I want to add. Like I think it's kind of a strategic choice of why Gadamer seems to strangely introduces the notion of absolute at this point.
Yeah, wow, great. Thanks, Henry. That makes a lot of sense. All right, we talk about absolute at this point. Sorry, Carlo, go right ahead.
I just want to make a quick comment. The Geistesgegenwart thing, I think that word also struck me. I think it just means like quick-wittedness or having the presence of mind. So I'm not sure it has anything. I'm not sure it's any attempt to translate any Aristotelian term in particular. I think he's just appealing to an idiosyncratic German term that is capturing what he's trying to get at, not having any particular thing in mind, but having the presence of mind to attend to whatever's needing to be or to be attended to. I want to say a longer thing, a little bit in response to Don's question about the accessibility of alien art. I take it that what for Gadamer is really special about artworks, at least some of them, is their ability to, or they're possessing a kind of wholeness to them. They're already sort of in being a meaningful whole. This isn't true for all artworks. Like Aristophanes, you get a comedy from Aristophanes, and there's some jokes in there that are clearly like context dependent upon the original time period, where like it's an insider joke that we're never going to get. And indeed, like some of the words that are coined in Aristophanes, I think we basically just have to guess because we have no real sense as to what's being referred to, but presumably the audience would know exactly what's being talked about. But other artworks aren't quite like this. They don't have this sort of occasionality to them. They're not sort of dependent upon a particular historical context that we can at best reconstruct. But other texts or works of art have a kind of wholeness such that we don't need to like go back and try and figure out what the insider joke was. The meaning, its full meaning, can be present to us. And so even though it might be an alien or strange meaning, there's nothing that the text lacks such that we couldn't get the meaning of the text or the artwork just from our present context, I guess I should say.
So Carla, is there really a difference in kind between what we would need to understand what's going on, the jokes in Aristophanes, and say if we're looking at a statue a sculpture of the Buddha? We have to understand what the pose means because different poses have different significance. Is it really that different, or as opposed to knowing what all the symbolism is for saints in a painting to appreciate it, or knowing something about Nixon in order to appreciate Nixon in China, the opera? I mean, is there really a difference there, or you feel like it's a real difference in kind and background knowledge?
Well, I think there's two different things. So I think that the degree to which a text is eminent in Gadamer's sense of the term is sort of lies on a spectrum. Like I think that there's, Aristophanes, right, has a few insider jokes, but the whole thing isn't, inscrutable to us. But like if I leave a note to if I write a note to myself and then forget what the note was about, like now the note really has become inscrutable. Like because it just doesn't form a meaningful whole in the way that an Aristophanic play would. So there's that like wholeness issue that's relevant. But then like, okay, what kind of background context do we need to sort of be able to grasp the full meaning of the text, even when it's, you're right, even when it forms a meaningful whole, it's hard to know what all is going on there without some background context. And then I think the thought is that it's kind of like the artwork, you got to know where to stand. You have the docent to talk you through the work, or you have the review, the critic talk you through the movie. But that helps you see, I think, what's already in the artwork. Like, I'm not sure that, like, the idea is that, okay, good, you might learn a thing or two, and that helps you see the artwork and appreciate it. But what you appreciate was already there. Mm-hmm. It's not like you don't need to like retrieve information. It's not like its meaning finally becomes whole once you retrieve meaning from outside of it. I think it's just a way to help me get the perspective to see the truth that's in it. I don't know. That's what I would say.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Jim.
Yes, I was thinking back to the previous comment and trying to listen to Carlo at the same time. He had many interesting things to say. I just wanted to then step back a little bit. Maybe I'll touch on his remark about the absolute. And the good Hegelians can correct me if I'm wrong, but at least when Hegel gets to absolute knowledge in the phenomenology, that's not literally everything you could say, but it means that spirit has now gone through itself in such a thoroughgoing way that there is no opposition. So you could say, when you're at the absolute knowing is where there is no longer a subject-object split. And I think it's not coincidental that when Gadamer then is in that vicinity and he mentions the Trinity, because the Trinity, well, you could say Hegel was a philosopher of the Trinity. And so that it is where the two are one, you could say. It's a kind of a fundamental unity where the unity are not separate parts. So I think all of that kind of metaphysics or better ontology is at issue for Gadamer, and the ontological character of the work. And notice even earlier comments, I think from Lorenzo in talking about the human intention, that page, Gadamer emphasizes that word work, and German and English should be the same. And he wants to separate it from here in the Greek, that it's not an ergon, that it's simply accomplished thing. So you get all this still movement, but a moving together where you could say almost everything is available. That's even a little bit misleading. It's not that everything is available, but there is not either the quote, the passing of time, the differentiating passing moment, and there is not the subject-object split. And he's conveying this in this different language that we're not quite familiar with. One last comment. In the end of that page, when he talks about the work of art having a superior reality, I'd also want to say that there's a kind of a quasi-Levinasian element in Gadamer's thought in this connection. And that's part about what we were saying, the work is to present itself, and it's something that we then come to recognize or see in some fashion. I'm not sure how that connected with everything now that I've said it, but I see a lot of it going on page 213.
Great, thanks, Jim. John Arthos.
So I mean, the Geistesgegenwart. So this idea of this sort of idiomatic sense that he's drawing on of sort of presence of mind or quick-wittedness, that in the moment you sort of get it, right? To me, that does relate specifically if you follow sort of the flow of his argument. He starts to, and I don't know what the English, so he starts to developed this whole lexicon of Aristotelian physics and metaphysics, right? He's introducing all of these terms, dunamis, and he's introducing them one after another. And then he relates them to art. And so then he has about a page where he talks about how this all relates to art, in which, in the sense in which it's not sequential, as Don said, it's actually this sort of, remember, we haven't even talked about this way that he repurposes the word lesen, right? But it's this way in which reading is all of these things of gathering, of picking apart. Again, it has that multifaceted temporality that plays out over time in different ways. And so, so then in the section where he's talking about art and relating it to Aristotelian metaphysics, which is really strange, right? But that's the case. That's the case he's trying to make. And he says this notion of so the expression is always ever a speaking. So it's again this sort of processive rather than sequential kind of experience that he's talking about. And it's in that context that then he brings it back to Aristotle and to energeia and to theoria. And he talks about this kind of seeing, right, which is theorein, which is the Greek to see. You have this sort of intimation at these moments. You have an intimation of the whole, and that's how you connect. So I would say, in terms of Hegel, Gadamer he likes the bad infinite. So the bad infinite would be the equivalent of Gleichzeitigkeit, not the Hegelian absolute in the sense of perfect fulfillment, but in this sort of weaker sense of, so he's sort of a Hegelian and not a Hegelian at the same time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Lorenzo. You might be muted still, Lorenzo.
Yeah, I think I kind of have a sense of where one would go with this, but I'm going to put it out there anyhow. One of the things that puzzle me is what I call the sort of the normative status of an interpretation. I mean, on 216, we've talked about, he says, it comes forth, it can't be put in words, and the viewer can be caught up. So in this concentrated power, so that the viewer then is, in a sense, fulfilling it, and at the same time, the viewer is interpreting it. What can it mean for the viewer to get it wrong? I guess is my question. And can it be intelligible for the viewer to get it wrong without there being sort of some intersubjective normative standards? And what might they be? I know Gadamer would have something like, as a protocol, anticipation of completeness. That'd be one of the concerns we'd have in an interpretation. But I guess I'll just leave it there. What would it mean for a viewer to get it wrong? And how would we flag that? I mean, what sense can we make of that?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. When you put so much weight on the experience
Mm-hmm.
that the person has, it's what would it mean to misinterpret a work of art, other than formal things like you didn't hear the whole thing all the way through?
Right.
Right. Does anyone have thoughts about that? Yeah, Jim?
Yeah, just as I wanted to say something back about what John Arthur said, but I can't resist. I think Lorenzo's question is one that Gadamer can't answer sufficiently, period. And if I tried to defend Gadamer for his reason not, he'd say that because there's no methodology, so the whole issue of the correct versus the false means it's up some measurable standard that can adjudicate, and you can say it's either right or wrong. And he never gets, if there is the anticipation of completeness, that's not sufficient. I mean, at one place he says in Truth and Method, well, your interpretation is false when it comes to nothing in the interpretation. So I think that's the question you're asking here, and it's prominent. He was already asking that question back in Truth and Method. So what was he saying there? I kept, and again, when I'm teaching, I'd say, well, if someone thinks that Nietzsche is just a Nazi sympathizer, he can't even say that because, you know, he's writing in the 1880s, not before the Nazism that we know about it took hold. So it's a silly question, but it's showing you that if you impose a meaning of the text, that's his idea, that it will come to nothing. So that's why my reference back a moment ago to Levinas has some merit, I think. That is, I don't want to take us off track now for the discussion, but so very briefly, Levinas, as you all know, it doesn't mean I decide to be responsible. No, I'm responsible before I make a decision. And I think that kind of gesture is at work in Gadamer when he wants to talk about truth in art. That is, I'm just in front of something that has this superior reality and I'm trying to let it speak. And he can't take it to the next step, which is a legitimate question about knowing when you're right or wrong in an interpretation. So I grant the question. I just don't think he can answer it. So you want to continue that? I'll come back to my other comment later.
Well, keep you in the queue, Jim, to come back about John's comment. Andrew, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah,
No?
I guess I really just have a question. I mean, I wonder if the notion of truth is really a question for epistemology. So he leaves that to the sciences. And my hunch is that as the experience of the work of art, all of this is articulated in relation to the natural sciences as he understands it, and has to be experienced in that context. So any kind of truth has to be thought of in the context of contemporary epistemology. In other words, insofar as the experience of art can transform or epistemology, maybe there's an element of truth there. Might be another way of saying this. I really have a question. I'm making statements here, but I actually don't know. I mean, the sense that we can't really extrapolate the question of art from the modern sciences, technological societies. So we should be thinking of truth in that context as well, right? So how art and science are somehow in tandem or in dialogue with one another for Gadamer on this question of truth. And I guess that's really just a question.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew.
If it makes any sense.
Yeah, absolutely makes sense. I think I might try to answer by reframing it and saying, how would you decide whether one interpretation is better than another? I think Gadamer says things about that. Certainly, interpretation can miss the mark. But I think of examples where I heard a piece of music and I got something out of it, and someone showed me something in it. And in that moment, I realized, wait, there's much more here than I was hearing before. And their interpretation of it then was superior because there was more revealed in my experience of it because of the ways they had directed me to attend to some things or other. It seems to be a very personal decision then about, now, I mean, there must be something intersubjective there, right? Because they're able to recognize the limitations of my interpretation and see the ways I'd missed certain things and how my interpretation could be richer if I paid more attention to other parts of the piece. Does that go some ways to answering the question, Lorenzo? Asking in terms of how we could say one interpretation is better than another?
Yes, in a way, it's an application of the anticipation of completeness, right? The better one gives a, has increased scope in a certain way. I mean, I think it's, yeah. It
Okay.
sense.
Yeah. Okay. Jim, you wanted to get back in on what John said about time.
Well, I like what you just said. I like to try to follow a conversation, not break it up. Okay. But I noticed that you changed the word from correct to richer.
Yeah.
And see, that's quite fine. You said it just more succinctly than what I was fumbling trying to say. I think that's right. We can differentiate, but when you use that word correct, that's so loaded. And I think richer is right. So you're closer to in other words, you're feeling more of the fullness of that work, and you're somehow, you're still getting at it. So I like that very much. I wanted to make something, my additional comment was very quickly. about seeing Gadamer's ontology at work here with respect to art. And we were talking about Aristotle, that gets back to John's comment, and Hegel here on these later pages. Don't forget that when I said that Hegel is also bringing forth the Christian Trinity, Hegel was a great Aristotelian. So that I remember one of my first books in Hegel, the book was divided into 12 chapters and the first 6 were all on Aristotle. And you have to see the whole idea of development comes from this rich notion of what Aristotle is doing with energeia and this whole movement towards fulfillment. So you could say at the end of the metaphysics, when you have Hegel's theology, that is thought God as thought thinking itself, that's simply absolute. That's the absolute in Hegel. It's the same thing. So he's weaving these threads here that I'm trying to say in the background of understanding Gadamer. You need to see how he's drawing from Aristotle, but that means at once putting Hegel over back with Aristotle. And then our only missing figure is Plato. But of course, as most of us know, Gadamer reads Plato from the later Plato, and that's why he's talking about the becoming of being, even in Plato, that he mentions earlier in this article. So I just wanted to throw that in. I hope it doesn't detract from the conversation.
No, great. Thanks, Jim. I'm going to do Cynthia and then Don.
Yeah, going back to the different interpretations and how we might say, one is better than another. I wonder if we couldn't draw again from, the temporality of the work itself. That is, he seems to say in Truth and Method that the work unfolds in a certain way. And he gives this example of music where he talks about on a score, the composer might write, different tempo markings, to play this legato or adagio or whatever, or even have a, metronome marking. But that puts us back into the empty time because it's calculable. Whereas we have to listen to how the piece unfolds itself and be attuned to its own movement. And I wonder if when you're listening to a performance, if they just play this part of it that really seems to beg for a more legato, this phrasing, and they just speed through it, that it would just feel that they've not been attentive to sort of the piece itself. And he even says at the end of this essay, something along the lines of how a musical performer attends to certain musical phrasings. So, there's something there that they're listening to. It's not just this thing that can be calculated, but rather it's the way that the piece itself manifests that we have to be, attentive to.
Yeah, great. Karen, can I ask if that is similar to what you were saying in the chat about the work of art itself presents its own criteria for, go ahead.
Yeah, I think Cynthia said more eloquently and with textual support what I was hoping to get at. So thank you, Cynthia.
Oh, thank you, Karen. I saw that and was thinking we were on the same page.
Okay. Yeah, great. That makes a lot of sense. Don.
Well, just I think what Cynthia and Karen were saying is exactly right and very, very helpful. He does think that there are errors in interpretation. On page 205, he says, Werner Jaeger tries to interpret this and he's wrong. No one can see this. Werner Jaeger is wrong. In fact, he beats up Werner Jaeger lots of times, So you see clear examples even here where he doesn't think that just anything goes in interpretation at all. But there isn't, we're not going to be saved from errors by method. If you don't want to make a mistake, you have a method and you follow the method, and then that assures you of certainty, as Descartes said. That's the point of method, so you can be certain of the results. Okay, but as to whether one interpretation is better than another or richer,
Don, we lost the sound there for a second. Hey, Don, we lost your sound. I don't know what happened. Did you get unplugged? I tell you what, we'll go to Carlo and we'll come back to you, Don. Okay. Go ahead, Carlo.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add, this is like a little musing of mine, but I've always found it striking that Aristotle, and I think you can find this in the Platonic dialogues too, will talk about things as being more or less true. I think we think of it as a binary concept, true or false, but things that are more true. So it seems like one of the ways in which something can be more true is that it speaks more directly to the particulars of reality. It's not sort of some general universal, but speaking to the particular for Aristotle. And I sort of thought, what's the Odyssey about? What's the truth of the Odyssey? Well, it reveals important truths about home and family. Well, I mean, that's a vague universe. I mean, that okay, yes, that's true, but it's not, it'd be far more true to speak more specifically about, what you learn about family and about home, in and through the epic. And so I think that one of the ways in which a play can be, an interpretation can be more true is if it speaks to the particularity of the particular meaning of that artwork, not just some sort of more broader universal that it, no doubt also, reveals in some sort of way. Just as a thought that I've always kind of been, I don't know if Gadamer ever says something quite like that, but I have, anyway, it's a thought that I have. And so I'm sharing it, damn it.
Thanks, Carlo. No, I mean, it makes sense. Does it also, is it also better if it is more relevant to us today? So you can imagine somebody saying, in a time of war, the Iliad, between the Iliad and Odyssey, the Iliad is the poem. And another time of migration, the Odyssey is the poem that speaks to us. Something like this. Would you say that says something more about the interpretation, that it speaks to how this helps make sense of our current things that are plaguing us? Or do you want to say, no, it's more about the work itself?
Well, I guess so, but I guess you can't interpret it without enacting it. And so then therefore bringing it to presence in our current context. So, I'm not sure those are extricable notions.
Yeah, you can't separate those two. Yeah. Jim, you looked anxious to get in here.
Well, because Carlo was spot on. And of course, the missing word was phronesis. And in your question back to Carlos was just re-emphasizing the phronesis, that it is, to use our language, contextual and situation specific. And like Aristotle says in the Ethics, we give to the degree of certainty that the subject matter allows. And for practical life, we don't have certainty. And so that's another element of Gadamer's hermeneutics, and he's retranslating phronesis, as most of us know from reading Truth and Method. So that same configuration is at work in interpreting art.
Yep. Okay, makes sense. We're getting close to the end here. Yes, John.
Yeah. So I think Lorenzo's question was excellent, and Jim's answer, I think, sounded right to me, that Gadamer doesn't really help us there. But I was wondering, so there are different ways that you could supplement or correct Gadamer on this question of, what's richer or more correct or whatever. But, there's what I noticed about this is, because I went to look for, withdrawal and the Heideggerian moment, and so Gadamer will always bring that up, but that sort of recedes in this essay, right? He's really more interested in becoming and growing and increasing the store of knowledge and all that stuff. And he does so on English page 214 and German page 390. He starts to get into that, but not very much. Concealment and withdrawal, he doesn't really use it to the extent that he would have used it before. He would have said, this is where we can sort of move more towards understanding. So for instance, our modern, our contemporary understanding of art may not be superior to the ancient Greek understanding of art, right? We don't have to progress in a Hegelian fashion. So I did want to throw that in there as
Okay, thanks. That ended suddenly. I wasn't sure. You want to throw that in there? Okay, good. Thanks, John. Lorenzo.
Yeah, this is a textual question about Gadamer's treatment of the various arts. I just want to get it in. When he's talking about, say, painting and sculpture and poetry, the completion, the moment of fulfillment is centered in what the reader, the viewer do. In the case of music, when he talks about the interpretation, he's talking about mostly the performer. And other times he'll talk about music and he says, well, the moment of uptake is in the moment of the listener. There's a kind of a overdetermination when he talks about music, because it's the performer who is interpreting, and the performer can interpret the score well or poorly, as Cynthia was talking about it very lengthy and very helpfully. And that's the moment of interpretation that Gadamer focuses on. It's what the performer does, but that's not really analogous to what happens in painting and sculpture and poetry, because in that case it's the listener and the viewer. But in music, that would be the listener who's not the performer, and so it's just a kind of an ambiguity there. Is it that it's the performer in music where we find the work coming to completion, or is it the listener, where the listener would be more analogous to the viewer in the case of painting? So that's just not clear. It seems to me that's an ambiguity there, or yeah.
Yeah, that's sort of why I was asking earlier about what it means to perform a painting or a sculpture. But John, did you want to say something about that?
I mean, I that's really a great observation, but to me, he is capacious. He wants it all, right? Those are different forms of reception. We are extending and continuing the work, right, in the various ways in which we interact with it.
Good. Cynthia.
Yeah, just to respond to Lorenzo's question, I think he means both. I mean, I think he means when it comes to music, the one who's performing the music, but also the one who's listening in that. Is to give another example from music. If you're listening to, let's say, a symphony or something, and you hear the introduction of a theme, and then you start to anticipate, well, what is that theme going to come back? How is it going to happen? And just following all of the same sort of contours of the piece. And you might anticipate at the beginning that it's going to end back in the home key, and then all of a sudden, the composer surprises you and puts it, in a completely different key. And when it comes to painting, he seems to use that word, to read, but he draws on that rich meaning, all those different words that he highlights in the German. But I guess I take that as a kind of performance, or better maybe to highlight enactment, to talk about Volzug, not just as, I mean, it seems like there's several different English words that would help us to understand Volzug. It's hard to just put one to it. So maybe when we're talking about music, performance is more clear. When we're talking about painting, enactment, but it's that same, it seems to me, idea of synthesizing all the parts, of lingering with it and trying to see how all of the parts come together to form that whole that speaks to us. And in that sense, it's not there until we do that. And it's that dialogue, that play between us and the artwork that allows it to come forth. But it's not just a passive thing on our side, it's active, but yet it's also awaiting, kind of that in between that he always emphasizes.
I think it's the case if we want to say in theater or dance or music, there's two interpretations. There's the performance and the reception by the audience. The performers are receiving as well. I think when it comes to static works, the interpreter, the person who's experiencing the work of art, is in a closer position to the performers than to the person in the audience. That is, they're engaging the work in a way that brings about the meaning of the work, and they're responding to it in ways that makes the work intelligible to them, in the same way a conductor working together with an orchestra then tries to figure out how they're going to put this work together so that meaning comes to life. So I think if there is sort of there's two interpretations versus one, I think that the interpretation that goes on in interpreting static works of art is closer to the performance of the in theater or music than it is to the people sitting in the audience. But that may be idiosyncratic and not Gadamer's actual view. We've got 5 minutes left. Are there things that have been brought up that you feel are hanging that you just want to make sure we get to talk about or settle or square on, or some basic questions that you figured never got? Yes, Henry, thank you.
At the very beginning,
Yeah.
John mentioned the importance of the decorative, and we never got back to it. And I find it very strange in this essay also, like how Gadamer made a big thing out of the decorative in the first paragraph and then near the end, but all he said about it is like 1 or 2 sentences. In contrast, in the Truth and Method, he actually spent a few paragraphs talking about the decorative. So yeah, it's like I think in this essay he talked a lot more about the architecture and just mentioned 1 or 2 sentences on the decorative. It seems a little bit weird on his part, because like he made such a big thing out of it in the beginning. And in relation to Truth and Method, because in Truth and Method, the decorative is really important there, as separating the beautiful and the art. So like the decorative is not art in the sense we understand today, as in like a thing that is built, a thing that is made for no other purpose than to be appreciated. It is made to be something else, but the beauty can shine forth when we look at it in summer, or when the moods become right. So like this in there in Truth and Method, it really highlights the ontological status of art. It's not about the object, but it's about the ontological presentedness or representedness of artwork. But here, I'm not sure what roles it serves in this article. So I'm interested to go back to this discussion.
It really doesn't get much play, does it? I think one thing you get when, like Gadamer, you really focus on the experience or the event that's brought about, is you have to give up focusing on different kinds of artworks and what counts as a work of art and what doesn't. Because what matters in the end is the event, the Ereignis, whether something is disclosed or not, whether there is the experience, the event of truth. And that can happen just as easily with something we call decorative as with something that is considered a great work of fine art hanging in the greatest museums around the world. So I think it makes sense that he includes architecture and the decorative at some point. But you feel like, Henry, that they really didn't get the same sort of attention that he should have given them.
Yeah, I agree with what you say. It feels a little bit strange how you make a big thing of it, but then later on you just talk very little about it.
It seems sort of thrown in. Yeah. It's almost like he's aware of that when he says, this isn't just an appendix, because it feels like it is just an appendix, right? Don, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, and this time I hope the battery doesn't die so that I have to change batteries. We don't have time to read 221 and 222 carefully and in detail, but there are a couple of points that stand out, and that is that he says on 222, presence and an accompanying function is always present in art. That's a surprise. I mean, because that is sort of not absolute. The point about decorative art is that it has its main function is to decorate, not to draw attention to itself, not to become a separate work of art. Okay. Jewelry is a special case because jewelry does catch your eye, and then you have to sort of attend to it. And the reason he says on 22, this is important is because in our life, in the modern world, art's place in life is not sure. We don't quite know what place art is supposed to have in our life. And architecture has this special problem because the first function of a building is function. But then it has to sort of hold back its artfulness and then open it to us. So it's a passage that deserves a lot of close attention, but I think one problem is that to what extent is something like abstract expressionism decorative, sheer decorative art? You know, I think he's really wrestling with some problems that are very central there. So appendix, yes, I agree with you about that, but the decorative is a very important issue here. Yeah.
Great, thanks. And John Arthos, you get the last word on this.
Okay. Yeah, I think again you have to look at it in terms of the flow of the essay and the structure of his argument, because what he does in this sort of coda, the whole coda is arranged to respond to the distinction that he wants to make between the arts, that arts in this finer way that he's talking about them, and what he calls the practical technical activities of our life, which is these things that objectify and commodify. And so it's in that context that he uses the examples of architecture and decorative arts and style, which is sort of the summary of the two. And so everything he says about architecture for this argument is the same as for the decorative. So I think you have to include those two things as examples of this transcending capacity of art. And the way that it transcends is that it is this sort of space that allows our life, our very life experience, to be realized, actualized, right? In this way that unifies all the different aspects of our life, not just in the way that we create these little experiences of entertainment. And so the decorative functions in that more holistic way, in the same way that architecture does.
Thanks. I'd like to say in the same way that conversation does as well. Helps to realize, bring all these aspects of our life together. And with that, I want to thank everyone for coming today and joining us and working through this important, long, and not easy text that brings up a ton of issues. And I think we did a really good job wrestling with lots of them. We're going to meet again in 2 months, December, January, February, mid-February. I'll send out an email with suggestions. If you have texts you really are excited about, let me know. I'll add it to the list so we can vote on that as well. Otherwise, I've got a standard list I keep adding to and taking things off. Any other questions at the end here? All right. Happy holidays, everybody.
Happy holidays.
Thanks for joining us. Take care.
Yep. Thanks for organizing, dude.